The hollow room. It was supposed to be the perfect apartment. Sophie had found it online. A one-bedroom unit in an old building nestled in the quiet part of the city. The rent was cheap, suspiciously so, but she didn't question it. As a struggling student, she couldn't afford to be picky. When the landlord showed her the place, he seemed eager to get it rented, barely making eye contact, and quickly handed her the keys after a brief tour. The apartment itself was nice enough. High ceilings, large windows, and a beautiful view of the park. But there was something about the bedroom that felt off. The walls were a dull shade of grey. The air in the room colder than the rest of the apartment. She chalked it up to poor insulation and thought nothing of it. That night, after unpacking most of her things, Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional groan of old pipes. But as the hours crept by, something started to feel wrong. The silence became heavier, pressing down on her like a weight. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud in the stillness. And then she heard it. A faint sound, like whispering. At first, she thought it was coming from outside, but as she sat up in bed, the noise seemed to be coming from within the apartment, specifically from the walls of the bedroom. She got out of bed, her heart pounding, and moved closer to the wall, pressing her ear against it. The whispers grew clearer, but they weren't in a language she understood. The sound was low, guttural, and rhythmic, like a chant. Sophie jerked away, her skin crawling. She backed out of the bedroom and spent the rest of the night on the couch, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. The next day, she called the landlord to ask if there had ever been any issues with the apartment. But he was vague, brushing off her questions. "It's an old building," he said. "Noisy pipes. Don't worry about it." That evening, Sophie tried to settle back into the routine of unpacking, pushing the strange experience from her mind. But as soon as the sun went down, the unease returned. She felt watched, as if the very walls were closing in on her. The whispers began again, this time louder, more persistent. Determined to figure out what was going on, she grabbed a hammer from the toolbox her dad had given her and approached the bedroom wall. She hesitated for a moment, heart racing before tapping on the surface. The sound was wrong, hollow. Swallowing her fear, Sophie swung the hammer at the wall. The plaster cracked easily, revealing an empty space behind it. She widened the hole, expecting to find pipes or wiring, but there was nothing, just a dark, empty cavity stretching deep into the building. And then she saw it. A hand. Pale and bony, it hung limply from the darkness inside the wall. Sophie stumbled back, gasping. She could barely process what she was seeing. The whispers grew louder, echoing around the room, filling her ears with their unnatural chant. Trembling, she turned and ran for the door. But as she reached the threshold, the bedroom door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Sophie yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the whispers became deafening. A cacophony of voices speaking in a language that seemed to claw at her mind. She turned around, pressing her back against the door. The hole in the wall had widened on its own, the plaster crumbling away as if being pulled apart by invisible hands. From the darkness, more hands emerged, reaching, clawing at the air, dragging themselves into the room. Sophie screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the voices. The hands, dozens of them now, crawled across the floor, the walls, reaching for her. They were cold, like death itself. And when they touched her, the cold seeped into her bones, paralyzing her with fear. She collapsed, her back sliding down the door as the hands wrapped around her arms, her legs pulling her toward the gaping hole in the wall. She fought, kicking and thrashing, but the strength was draining from her. The last thing she saw before being dragged into the darkness was the outline of a face, pale, hollow-eyed, emerging from the shadows. The next day, the landlord showed the apartment to another potential tenant, his expression as blank as ever. When they asked why the rent was so low, he simply smiled and said, "People don't stay here long." The apartment remained perfect, at least on the surface. No one ever saw Sophie again. But on quiet nights, if you press your ear against the bedroom wall, you can still hear the whispers, the voices of those who were never meant to leave.